If you've spent any time at all on the internet, you've likely heard about Fallout New Vegas. Obsidian Entertainment's 2011 title is still one of the most talked about games.
What in the goddamn?
New Vegas remains a masterclass in blending fun, engaging gameplay with rich, layered world building. Now, I usually don't post content about video games on this channel. It's usually about films, either original films that I've made myself or video essays about films that everybody knows, about their meaning, the themes, the hidden symbolism.
Too many people have opinions on things they know nothing about.
Oh, and I also make vulgar, juvenile sketch comedy.
Great. A moron.
But I mostly make content about the deeper artistic layers of film, not video games. And that's because video games rarely have layers of symbolism and theme. Certainly not in the same way great works of cinema do. With video games, it's very surface. You go through the story, which is usually predictable and or heavily borrowed from movies, kill the bad guys, rinse and repeat. Which they can't really be blamed for. Most video games have dozens, if not hundreds of hours of content in them. You can't expect every line of dialogue to be excellent.
Sticks to the road like shit to a blanket.
But some video games rise above this. Some video games make use of their extended runtime to say just as much, if not more, than your average art film. I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. Fallout New Vegas is one of these games.
Unpolluted by the wrath and folly of a bygone generation.
It's a game that's not only an achievement in storytelling and immersion, but in its mastery of meaning and metaphor. It's jam-packed with philosophical wisdom.
The kind you might encounter if you took time to read some books.
It's layered with statements on sociology, psychology, economics, history. Really, it's about human nature in general.
The fundamental premise is to envision history as a sequence of dialectical conflicts.
Non-stop whoring and drugs.
Autocracy.
Failed pre-war socioeconomic policies.
Commie ghosts.
But what I think truly sets New Vegas above the rest is the allegory found within it, the commentary it makes, not of society or nature, but of itself. I have a theory. Well, to be honest, it isn't completely my theory. My friend Alex came up with most of this, and I found it compelling enough to make a video on it. I figured if I was going to be subjected to him loudly screaming about this game for years, at the very least I could get something from it. Give me that content, baby! I argue that the thematic tale New Vegas weaves together is about, at some level, the making of New Vegas. In other words, I think the game developers of this game buried an allegory within the game about the game development of the game itself. Game. Like many of the great works of art, like many of the masterworks in literature or cinema, the personal story of the artists themselves is present in the piece of art. Let's look at an example of that. The place I'm tempted to point you to is my video on 2001: A Space Odyssey and the personal allegorical message I think Kubrick hid within it, but there's much easier and clearer examples of this. But still, please watch it. Please watch it. Please. Scorsese's 1973 film Mean Streets tells the story of Charlie, a young man who's grown up in and around the criminal underworld of Italian neighborhoods in New York. Now, obviously, this story is a personal one for Scorsese, seeing as how he grew up in the same sort of environment, but it's not just about the location. It's even more personal than this. It's about morality. It's about Scorsese's relation to the moral struggle within the character of Charlie, not just the character's upbringing. Throughout the film, Charlie is debating on what he should do with his life. Should he escape this life of sin and choose a holier path like the church wants him to? Should he surrender to the streets or to the church? Leading up to the production of this film, Scorsese himself was asking a similar question in his real life. Scorsese was on the path to becoming a man of God, but something else was calling to him, pulling him away from seminary school and the church. It wasn't necessarily the streets like it was for Charlie in the film, it was the film, or rather a career in filmmaking. Scorsese took the debate that was raging inside himself of whether he should be a priest or a filmmaker and used it to create a story for a character. What I'm trying to get across in this video is that the developers of Fallout New Vegas did something similar. Because in the Fallout universe, the world has been ravaged by a nuclear war, and the survivors took shelter in these underground vaults, and now, more than 100 years later after the apocalypse, the survivors are trying to rebuild, and you get it. The first Fallout game was developed and published by Interplay Studios and released in 1997. It's a turn-based RPG, just what you'd expect a late 90s PC game to look and play like. But what set Fallout apart from the other games of this time wasn't its graphics or movement or fighting mechanics, although those were also great. It was its story, its writing, its world, and how the player could affect it. Fallout crafted a world that was both deeply foreign and painfully familiar, placing the player in a somehow relatable struggle for survival in a world that's populated by mutants, and even uglier mutants, and also this guy. It's difficult to state just how intellectually above Fallout was from the other video games at the time. It was revolutionary, and releasing the following year, Fallout 2 massively improved upon this groundbreaking system of the original. The sequel was published by Interplay again, and developed by a subsidiary studio within Interplay called the Black Isle. But jumping ahead for a moment, the members of these studios would go on to form Obsidian Entertainment a few years later, and under Obsidian Entertainment they'd be contracted into making Fallout New Vegas. So, to make this less confusing, I'm just going to rope all these studios into one name and say that Obsidian also made Fallout 1 and 2, even though they weren't called Obsidian when they did. But what they were called when they made these games doesn't matter. What matters is that these games were huge hits. Their writing and world building was like nothing the medium had ever seen. They attracted an absolutely dedicated fan base. These games were a big deal, but apparently not big enough, because no matter how talented the developers were, Obsidian couldn't seem to stay financially afloat. As the years went by, they became so broke and indebted that they were eventually forced to sell their most valuable asset. In 2007, 10 years after the release of the original masterpiece, Obsidian had to sell the Fallout name and intellectual property to Bethesda Studios. Bethesda's parent company, ZeniMax, quickly put the Bethesda team to work on a new Fallout title, one that would modernize the franchise, thrusting it into the 3D realm with a massive filled-out world for players to explore. Bethesda released Fallout 3 in 2008. Looking back on it now, it shouldn't have been called Fallout 3. It was set in an entirely different area than the first two and told totally different stories, but no matter how tethered it was to the past games, it was met with glowing reviews. It did do something special. It took an old concept, an old world, and rebuilt it for a new generation of gamers. For many players, myself included, this was their first time in the Fallout universe. It wasn't as dense as the originals, and it didn't give the player the same amount of choice and freedom, but it was still a great game. Around the time leading up to its release, Bethesda knew that it was going to be a hit. It knew it needed to churn out another Fallout title as quickly as possible. But Bethesda was already starting work on their next Elder Scrolls game, so ZeniMax needed to call in another studio to make this next Fallout game. They figured who else would be better to do the job than the guys who invented the original. So that's exactly what they did. They called in the guys from Obsidian and told them they could finally make their follow-up title to Fallout 1 and 2. The resulting game was quite possibly the greatest of all time. Fallout New Vegas. Like the other Fallout games, it takes place over 100 years after a massive nuclear war has wiped out the world's governments. All civilizations were destroyed. Now, it's about figuring out how to pick up the pieces. The quote at the beginning and end of every Fallout game,
War never changes,
isn't so much a statement about war, but of human nature. War never changes because people never change. This line tells us it's within people's nature to fight, to divide into factions and battle for what's left. We've done it for all of human history, and according to Fallout, we will keep doing it. But I think what's even more important about Fallout is the question it poses. How will humanity rebuild? Will it ever really rebuild? New Vegas examines these same questions, but with more magnification. It asks what sort of factions, what sort of governments, what sort of civilizations will be able to sustain themselves in this war-torn hellscape of a world. New Vegas thrusts the player into a world with different factions fighting for control of the map. The game asks the player to weigh the pros and cons of different ideologies and economic systems and styles of government, with different factions representing different sides of these sociological debates.
Long-term stability at all costs.
To enforce, one must have force.
Equal respect, representation, and protection under the laws of a just republic.
A nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers.
Just as I have no interest in legislating or otherwise dictating what people do in their private time.
You are the great western light of California, torchbearers in the darkness, living reminders of all that is best in our republic.
The individual has no value beyond his utility to the state.
Okay, let's just get back out of here. What the hell are you waiting for? You think I want to get shot? Let's go.
The only thing all these different factions have in common is that they've all borrowed from the past. None of them are new systems, they are merely old systems from humanity's pre-war past, resurrected in the post-war present.
I've resurrected Vegas, spirit intact.
He's fixated on restoring the glory of the great Khans.
All of the factions in New Vegas use concepts from the past world to create themselves in the new.
This was the same fire that burned in the heart of the old world that preceded us. We are the heirs of that civilization. Torture.
Fallout New Vegas is about taking the ideas from the past and repurposing them for the present. So let's look at some of these factions in Fallout New Vegas and see where this theme presents itself. The first faction I want to talk about is the New California Republic, or NCR.
Come quietly now. I don't want to have to hurt you.
You ever had a brother? Some dumbass younger brother, say, who knocked up the pastor's daughter, can't hold a job, and is home away as a jail cell? That's NCR. Their compass is spinning all the time.
It's basically a resurrection of the American system and functionally the main character of the Fallout series in general. Over the course of Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas, we watch as the small community of Shady Sands becomes a burgeoning nation-state. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR's borders are massive, and they have revitalized the old-world concept of representative democracy. In theory. It values individual rights and freedom, in theory.
All men and women created by you know the thing.
Carry our principles with us.
You'll be keeping an eye out for any. You'll be keeping an eye out.
The light of our society shines beyond our borders.
It's just another expansive imperialistic military force wearing the clothes of a caring nanny state, which would be fine if it was functional. The people who are liberated or taken under the NCR flag should, in theory, be treated to much better lives. But the NCR often overextends itself, never having enough resources to remain effective.
Need to be able to get funding when they need to bring
Whether due to corruption or unnecessary bureaucracy, the group seems to be perpetually unable to preserve any real sense of law and order.
As a young man, I was taught to venerate President Tandy of Shady Sands, the founding mother of the New California Republic. Did you know her presidency lasted 52 years? And that her father, Aradesh, was the Republic's first president? Does that sound like a democracy to you? Or a hereditary dictatorship? Things ran smoothly, more or less. And as soon as she was gone, as soon as there really could be democracy, what happened then? Ever since losing its queen, the NCR has been weaker, more diffuse. Democracy has been its weakness, not its strength.
The faction known as Caesar's Legion, or Kaiser's Legion to those who have never spoken to a woman, serves as a bloodthirsty boogeyman, or bogeyman to those who insist on adding stupid repetitive jokes to the script.
In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world.
The Legion bases itself off Imperial Rome. It's a dictatorship run by an emperor. They use slavery, conquest, torture, and fear to grow their power and influence in the New World.
Don't worry. I won't have you lashed to a cross like the rest of these degenerates.
Why would it bother me to enslave these wretches? They have no purpose, no creed, no honor. They live in pitiful squalor.
It's destructive, violent, terrible, cosplay fascism. But we are told the roads in Legion territories are always safe and trade caravans on time. The style of law and order they produce is an effective one, but it comes at a high moral cost.
I would rule as the chief executive. I would not answer to a board of directors or any other entity. Nothing to impede progress. If you want to see the fate of democracies, look out the windows.
The other major faction in the game is essentially one man, Mr. House. He's the mysterious figure who owns all of the city of New Vegas, a pre-war captain of industry.
I prefer the term autocrat.
Sporting the style and outlook of American business magnate Howard Hughes, Mr. House is a capitalist through and through.
A society of customers. With all that money pouring in? Give me 20 years and I'll reignite the high technology development sectors.
He wants to run his city, his business, his way, far from the clutches of some encroaching government or LARPing tyrant. He's even gone as far as to create a private robot army to enforce the rules in his business empire. His version of law and order comes from automating away all potential for human error, ensuring his business runs like a clock, because it's comprised only of clocks. His system functions perfectly, but he's removed all the humanity, all the nature, all the soul, and replaced it with technocratic slavery, albeit it's a slavery that's far more comfortable than anything the other factions are offering. These are the main 3 factions in the game, but even the smaller ones base themselves off of aspects from the past. The Great Khans are a roaming tribe of biker bar barbarians. They are commanded by a single warlord. They use minimal technology from the past, but they do borrow heavily from ancient cultures. As their name implies, they are inspired by the Mongols, but also display aspects of both Native American culture and white, rural, meth head culture. As American as they come, I suppose. They are the furthest removed from civilization, at least culturally. Whether you view them as tribal warlords living off the land or rugged, off-the-grid bikers, they are societal outcasts all the way. Some members of this tribe you'll find living in teepees, others a trailer. The Kings are a gang of greasers who all dress up like Elvis, even though they don't know who Elvis is. They all dress up like him because, according to them, pictures of this king character were all over the walls of their hideout when they first moved into it years ago. Their hideout being the remains of an old Vegas school of impersonation.
There were some posters left that were pretty well preserved, which is how we know all this stuff was based on the same guy. The thing of it is, we don't even know what his name was. All the posters just referred to him as the King. We've tried to pass our philosophy on to the people of Freeside, but not everyone is ready to be a king. But I like to think I keep the memory alive.
As you can see, this game and its factions are about using ideas from the past to progress in the present. Much of what the player does in this game involves deciding the fates of these different factions. For example, the Brotherhood of Steel hoards technology from the past and uses it to strengthen themselves, if they even use it at all.
They care little for history. Some of the Brotherhood scribes we captured further east didn't even know the name of their founder. They have no vision. They offer no future. They're a dead end.
We're talking about a coterie of bulging-eyed fanatics who think all pre-war technology belongs to them.
They never use the tools from the past to rebuild. They steal the tools from those that do, and use this old tech to further isolate themselves from others. The Boomers do something similar.
I'm Pete, keeper of the story. Here our mighty guns destroy any savages who might try to harm us before they can even reach our gates.
They use their stockpile of past military weaponry like mortars and landmines to isolate themselves behind a wall of explosives. When the player first encounters these factions, they have no desire to grow or evolve or rebuild. When the player finishes interacting with these factions, it can end in only one of 2 ways. Either the faction unshackles themselves from isolation and ventures out into the world to join in the rebuilding efforts, or the faction is destroyed. Over and over, the main idea of New Vegas is reinforced by how you settle these factional disputes. To progress, we must take the past and blend it with the new. Take what was, and fuse it with what is. But remember, the whole theory behind making this video says that the game is allegorical, that its theme and stories represent the story of the developers. So let's draw some parallels here. Remember back to the story of this game's development. Obsidian had to sell their baby, their Fallout franchise, to Bethesda. And even though they thought they were leaving Fallout in the past, they were called back in to make another one. They were given the opportunity to make a follow-up game to their original works, to make a new version of the once-forgotten world they thought they were leaving in the past. New Vegas was the new version of their old work, their old past world, set in a new 3D realm, with a new company in control of them. You see it? You get it? The theme of the game, it's presented itself now? Okay, borrowing from the past, rebuild the future? Alright, I think the quest line, and really the faction in New Vegas where this allegory is most prominent, is the Enclave. The Enclave was a secret, Illuminati-like shadow government that ran the world before the nuclear war. After the governments of the world fell apart, they still managed to maintain a bit of control, though. But in the time that New Vegas is set, the Enclave has long been defeated. How the player comes across these quests that involve the Enclave is by meeting the character Arcade Gannon. By the way, did you know Arcade Gannon is gay? It's not like it matters, which it really doesn't have any impact on the story or anything, which is why I think it actually does matter. You know, it's almost like, wouldn't it be interesting if we wrote characters to be like actual characters and not just... Okay, just like how Arcade being gay has no impact on his story, so too does the fact that he is gay have no impact on what I'm trying to say. We're moving on now. He's gay. As the player gets to know Arcade more, they learn that Arcade's father was a soldier in the Enclave before it fell. The player's job in the quest is to go around the map and round up all the former members of Arcade's father's former squad in the Enclave, at least the ones that are still alive.
So what's this reunion all about then? Why the need for a bunch of old war horses like us? I'm intrigued, so I'll go to this reunion.
The player gathers them back together and gives them a cause to fight for, gives them one last mission.
But if I get one more chance to fly, count me in.
Swooping in on a vertibird, guns blazing? Haven't done that in years, but all right, I'm in. Well, now there's an interesting idea. Do a bit of good before we're all dead and forgotten.
This quest line, this part of the game, it's essentially a story of getting the band back together, much like the making of the game itself. The Obsidian developers are just like these old remnants of the Enclave using their old ships and armor to get back together for one last mission. I know I've already said this too many times and I'm probably going to keep saying it, but New Vegas is about looking back to the past and using these past tools to change the future. And, you know, I think this seems like a pretty positive message too. You know, it seems all pretty well and good. Except, well, the next part of this story, it kind of changes things. Because as the Obsidian developers were making the game, they, much like the message of the game, were feeling pretty positive. But like I said, this soon changed. When it came closer to New Vegas' release date, Obsidian realized they needed more time. 18 months was not enough to develop this game. Most games of this size took twice as long. New Vegas was not to the level of perfection that the Obsidian development team was known for. It had some glitches and was in desperate need of many layers of polish. Now, usually, games in this state, especially games that have huge potential like this one, can get delayed, giving the developers enough time to make sure that when it ships, it's perfect. But Bethesda, or ZeniMax, or whoever was above them, they wouldn't let Obsidian delay the game. They wouldn't budge on the release date, meaning that when New Vegas was released, it had a few rough edges. The sort of rough edges that initial players and reviewers would notice. So, when it came out, it wasn't seen as the masterpiece it is today. It took time for people to really play it and cultivate these positive reactions. But again, at first glance, the game didn't seem like it was anything amazing. But again, it was, and it is, but it just didn't look like it was at first. It got good reviews, but it didn't get perfect ones. Okay, well, so what? Who cares if it took the public a few years to realize the game's beauty? Who cares if the initial reviews weren't calling it a masterpiece? Who cares if I hit my neighbor's dog with a lawnmower while high on PCP? Well, when I was discussing the development of the game, I neglected to mention the Metacritic bonus agreement scandal. If such a lame little industry is capable of producing something that really could be called a scandal. But anyway, what happened is that Obsidian was given a deal by Bethesda when they began developing New Vegas. The deal was that if New Vegas got high enough reviews, the Obsidian team would get bonuses. Now, I think I should probably stress that bonuses are pretty normal at the end of a game's development. It wasn't like Obsidian was standing to get some special prize by making this deal with Bethesda. It was really just their only option if they wanted to get any bonuses at all. The deal said that in order for the bonuses to be paid to the Obsidian team, New Vegas would have to score an 85% or higher on Metacritic. But, like I said, New Vegas wasn't met purely with praise when it was released. And after all of the reviews and scores had been turned in, its Metacritic score ended up being an 84%. Even though it was below the mark by only 1%, Bethesda refused to pay Obsidian their bonuses.
From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
So, around the time of the actual release of the game, the positive vibes and happy thoughts and feelings of using the past to rebuild a brighter future, yeah, all of that all dried up.
What the fuck are you doing? My brother died at the Battle of Hoover Dam. You're desecrating a war memorial.
The Obsidian team was rightfully upset, but there was an even bigger problem. Even though Bethesda had just screwed them over, the Obsidian team were still contracted to make the DLC for New Vegas. And boy, did they make some. The Fallout New Vegas DLC is known as some of the best that's ever been made, not only in the Fallout series, but the industry at large. Unlike other Bethesda products, I'm sorry, I'll stop complaining about this, everybody else complains about this. Is this considered beating a dead horse? The New Vegas DLCs were amazing. Somehow they were able to live up to the quality of the original game. However, they are very different in terms of the stories they tell, and more importantly, in the themes found within them. In fact, thematically speaking, the DLC is the complete opposite of the original game. The DLCs are not about using the past to rebuild, they're about destroying the past and moving on. After having been out for quite a while, most people had likely finished the main story of New Vegas once or twice before getting access to the DLC. Players were craving more gameplay, so when Dead Money came out and it promised more of this, people flocked to it. After downloading the DLC, players will hear a new radio broadcast blaring out across the Mojave. But upon following the radio signal, the player is knocked out and whisked away to a new location. A location that is set around a massive old casino, the Sierra Madre. It was the pre-war pinnacle of technology and class. It's a tempting jewel, one that draws in those greedy and daring enough to try and find the secrets within it. By secrets within it, I mean the money and gold that's hidden within its vault. But anyway, after following this radio signal and being knocked out, when the player wakes up, they find themselves to be captured by a madman. This madman, Father Elijah, is obsessed with making these riches his own, obsessed with using his mastery of technology to plunder this vault and use it for his own gain. Eventually, the player breaks away from Elijah and makes it into the vault alone, and as expected, there is an endless amount of gold inside of it. The only problem is that the gold bars are too heavy to carry, and the casino vault's security measures are out to kill the player. To survive, to get away, to complete the objective, to complete the quest of the DLC, the player must leave the gold behind, making everything the player has done throughout the DLC all for nothing.
I'll prop your broken body in view of the Sierra Madre so you can see what you came to steal, forever out of reach as you die.
This DLC is not about plundering the forgotten treasures of the past. It's about walking away. In the next DLC that was released, Honest Hearts, the theme of moving on is also quite prevalent. In it, the player ventures into a land untouched by war. A land of majestic mountains and beautiful landscapes and tribal people living off the land, but this doesn't mean the worst parts of human nature are nowhere to be found. There are two religious tribes bickering for all-out control of this wilderness. Now, it hasn't become a full-on war yet, but it's about to. The tribe that forces the player to take their side is in a debate of what exactly they should do, on whether a grand battle for the territory would be worth it or not. The player has to decide whether the tribe should stay and fight, but in the process lose what they once were, or leave. If they fight this war, they will alter themselves into something unrecognizable. So, it seems the smartest and certainly the most moral outcome is with the tribe exiting the area and searching for a new home. But no matter what the tribe does, they end up leaving their history behind. In the third DLC, Old World Blues, the player is thrust into a pre-war science research facility. While it hasn't been operational for 200 plus years, the scientists who occupied it have found a way to remain alive. Well, I guess that's one of the questions this DLC asks. You know, are they really alive? They exist as just brains inside machines. Through a series of wacky and honestly way too complicated reasons, so does the player. Yes, you get your brain removed, just play it. I don't know. Like the DLCs before, the player is trapped by those above them, those obsessed with or even from the past. I suppose I could say that the player is like the developers of this game, in a way. But then in another way, I see this comical group of scientists who also represent the developers, stuck in a bubble, forced to work on the same futile experiments over and over. Ultimately, the player ends up breaking away from the scientists' control, and in most cases are forced to destroy these scientists from the past before they can leave the research base behind. This is by far the silliest and most enjoyable of the 4 DLCs. It followed on the heels of the Honest Hearts DLC, which is about forgiving yourself and moving on from the past for your own good, and I see this DLC now as almost a healing moment. They make a DLC where they just do whatever they want, and they have a lot of goofy fun.
Have you ever tried to indulge in all-consuming urge to kill when you don't have opposable thumbs? Or hands? Or anything other than a bread slot? You'd have a lot of pent-up anger too.
I should also mention that the lore, the stories behind the DLCs, they're all connected in some way, but this one, Old World Blues, it has the most connections. We find Elijah, the guy from Dead Money, we find his camp in the ruins of this research base. We learn that he spent some time here on his way to the Sierra Madre. And then we also find several clues to a mysterious man named Ulysses, a man we haven't met yet, but in the arrival of the final DLC, we will. Lonesome Road is probably the darkest of the 4 DLCs. Sure, Dead Money might be more visceral and haunting, but I think what Lonesome Road says is far darker. So again, after players download the DLC, they'll hear another radio broadcast, and they are led to the Divide by this mysterious character named Ulysses. The Divide is an area that is even more desolate and devastated than the area that you just spent the rest of the game in. Everything is on fire, or irradiated, or crumbling. It is not pretty. This is beyond the normal destruction that players are used to seeing. There is no chance of anything ever being rebuilt here. And while in the Divide, players are introduced to multiple new threats, not only to themselves in the moment, but to the world of the entire Mojave, the entire map of the original game. These new existential terrors threaten to one day completely destroy the area we have spent so much time in trying to fix. In the vanilla game, it doesn't matter what faction you sided with, whether you picked House, NCR, Legion, or went with the wild card, do it your own ending. The threat of the tunnelers, these new monsters that are moving through the Divide, these tunnelers will one day make that decision unimportant. They're moving through the Divide. They are coming for the Mojave, and it seems there's no way of stopping them. By the end of the DLC, after we've been drawn to Ulysses' hideout in a pre-war missile silo, we can choose to launch the nukes that silo holds. And what are the targets for these potential nuclear strikes? We can blow up the NCR's territory, the Legion's territory, or even darker, both factions. That's right, at the end of this DLC, players have the literal option to destroy everything. As a send-off for this game, it's kind of a dark one. The developers gave the players the option to completely destroy the future of the world they spent so much time on. And even if the players choose not to launch any of the nukes, the tunnelers, that threat that I was talking about from before, they're gonna destroy the Mojave in the next decade anyway. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this fact. Like, the tunnelers are this crazy imposing force that's moving into the Mojave, and there's no stopping them once they get there. And there's just no stopping them at all, even in the good ending. The place that we, the players, and they as the developers have spent so much time in will be gone for good. The developers' final send-off to this series is one that leaves little hope of ever returning to it. Do you see how the DLCs differ thematically from the vanilla game? The theme of the DLCs isn't about using the past, it's about forgetting it. Destroying it. It's about unshackling yourself from what was before and walking away. And that's exactly what the developers of Obsidian did. When they started the New Vegas project, they thought they had a chance at using their past creation to make something new in the present, and I suppose they did this. But this new world robbed them. It screwed them over. So, they left it on a note that says the opposite. They ended it with a final statement that wasn't one of holding on, but of letting go. This shift in theme in the DLC and what this says about the original game and the development of the game itself is why I think Fallout New Vegas is the best video game of all time. It rose to artistic heights that were thought impossible for the medium of video games to ever climb to. Saying it did things that no other game could ever do is beyond an understatement. Like the finest of filmmakers, or really artists in general, the developers related the stories within their game to personal stories of their own. When we combine with this fact that New Vegas is just an amazingly immersive and entertaining game on its own without any of the themes, then I don't know how anyone can walk away from this without thinking that this game is without a doubt a masterpiece and probably one of the most important and impressive pieces of media ever created. Alright, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. There's a buffet of content in this game. If you guys want to see more of it, then ask for it. And like the video, and subscribe, and share it. And when you do subscribe, make sure you click the little bell notification icon thing. Otherwise, it's basically a wasted subscription. And okay, I think I've talked enough.
What's it sound like I'm saying? If I was saying what you said I was saying, then yeah, I said it.
What in the goddamn...